Okay, good evening there all. Welcome to the webinar titled by Doing Work When the World is on Fire, Academic Research During COVID-19, which will be held by Professor Nergis Hocam. First of all, we are hosting an honorable guest today under the Graduate School of Social Sciences, which is organized by International Relations and the Political Science departments. I also would like to thank Professor Nur Hocam and the Professor Said Hocam for organizing these scientific events. What I believe that it's going to be very, very beneficial for the graduate and postgraduate students. And then today, I'm very happy to tell you that Professor Nergis Hocam will make the speech on this title, and it's going to be more attracted by the graduate and the postgraduate students at the Near East University. Now, as a moderator, I would like to give a speech to Professor Nur Köprülü to moderate this webinar. Yes, Professor Nur Hocam.
Thank you, Mustafa Hocam. Thank you very much for your kind consideration. And once again, I would like to welcome Professor Nergis Hocam from York University. And also, I would like to thank, as the director of our Graduate School of Social Sciences, and also my dear colleague, Professor Dr. Said Akshit, for organizing such an, I think, very timely debate, because doing work when the world is on fire during this pandemic is really, really a timely debate. Our guest speaker today is actually very familiar because she also visited our university, our faculty last February, just before the pandemic. But let me just to give details about her academic background. Professor Nergis Canefe is a Turkish-Canadian scholar of public international law, comparative politics, forced migration studies, and critical human rights. She has held posts in several European and Turkish universities and is a faculty member at York University, Canada since 2003. She regularly serves at the executive board of several international organizations, including International Association of Forced Migration Studies, and is the co-editor of Journal of Conflict Transformation and Security. She penned close to 100 scholarly articles and several books, including Transitional Justice and Forced Migration. It's an edited volume by Cambridge University Press in 2019. Another one is The Syrian Exodus, a monograph published in 2018 by Bilgi University in Istanbul. Another one is titled The Jewish Diaspora as a Paradigm, Politics, Religion, and Belonging. It is an edited volume published in 2014 by the Jewish Studies series. Another one is in Turkish, Milliyetçilik, Kimlik ve Aidiyet. It is also a monograph published in 2006. And in English, Nationalism, Identity, and Belonging, again published by Bilgi University in Istanbul. We have another work of her, Turkey and European Integration, Accession Prospects and Issues, published in 2004, and an edited volume in collaboration with Mehmet Uğur, and which was also published by the prestigious publisher Routledge. Her most recent book is Limits of Universal Jurisdiction, a critical debate on crimes against humanity, by University of Manchester International Law Series. It is in press, and to be followed by a volume on unorthodox minorities in Middle East and comparative politics of administrative law in Middle East. Her scholarly work appeared in Nations and Nationalism, Citizenship Studies, New Perspectives, Refugee Watch, Refugee, Southeast European Studies, Peace Review, Middle Eastern Law and Governance, Journal of International Human Rights, and Narrative Politics. Professor Canefe is also a trained artist, and her designs and murals have been showcased regularly since the year 2008. I'm really glad to welcome dear Professor Nergis Canefe, and we would like to thank her very much, because we know that her time is really valuable. She's very hectic and very dynamic academic. Thanks for being us today. And the floor is yours, Hocam. Welcome to Nergis University.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. Today, we're going to delve into subjects which are of particular relevance at the moment under COVID pandemic circumstances, especially regarding the recent upsurge and then the potentially more deadly new variant of the virus. It appears across the world, higher education institutions will be shut down and face-to-face interaction will not be possible for at least another 6 months. So under the circumstances, it is of particular importance that we provide guidance and assurance to young researchers and our doctoral and MA students, LLM students, who are engaged in research and who are continuing with the process of knowledge production and publication, as well as, I know this sounds rather surreal, but potential forms of field work. So I will be doing two things today. The first one is revisiting the code of ethics for research in social sciences, humanities, and law. And I will invite our participants to think about alternative ways of engaging with research and knowledge production under pandemic circumstances. For each of these discussions, I will try to allocate about 20 minutes, and I'm going to urge our participants to write their practical questions as well as larger ethical questions in the comments and chat box, which I will get to see as I'm discussing the topics I'm covering, and I'll hope to address them. I hope to address them at the end of the discussion that I present here. So research under pandemic conditions poses particular ethical challenges, and not only because of the usual list of items that we have to cover, such as unequal power relations, legal impact of research on the subjects of research, potential criminalization of subjects of research if they are in precarious situations, politicized research context, as well as the policy relevance of our research, in addition to our dependence on government, non-government services, funding, and civil society support. So these items apply to research across the board in both social sciences and legal studies. At the moment, however, research ethics boards, including the ones in Cyprus, are not necessarily alive to particular ethical challenges that are emerging from COVID circumstances. I think this is partly due to the fact that this pandemic and the pandemic condition has been treated as transient, and there was a waiting game in terms of return to normal. And as the months pass and as we're approaching the first anniversary of the lockdown and shutdown conditions in higher education institutions, it's becoming quite obvious that we have to adjust to these ongoing circumstances. And we also have to approach ethical issues and code of ethics and research practices from a different angle, so that hundreds and thousands of graduate students are not put on hold in terms of doing their desired work and engaging in productive knowledge production, creation, and knowledge mobilization. So the first point that I'd like to emphasize is the research methodologies that I incorporate in my work, and I encourage my students to incorporate, is a broad, engage, and critical notion of research ethics. That means it is not simply applying to your particular circumstance, but you are aware of the fact that you are a principled and privileged agent in knowledge production in a higher education institution. And therefore, there are certain thresholds that you would need to satisfy, whether you're doing research under COVID circumstances or otherwise. And I must also that being said, I must acknowledge that what I'm going to discuss is neither comprehensive nor exhaustive. I am currently writing on the subject, and there are other guidelines I can share with people if they're interested in. but I'm simply going to highlight some of the key points of what the discussion has been in the North American context, as well as in other contexts, including India, concerning research under COVID-19 circumstances. So let's start with the definitions that are key to our understanding. Research in the academic setting is defined as a principled activity that involves not just data collection and knowledge creation and data synthesis, but it also includes application of a theoretical framework. And the understanding is that the research that results from academic activity will acknowledge the individual and community partners, if that is applicable, as well as having general applicability in terms of field expertise. So the interlocutors that we have in conducting our research include people that we interview, people who are in focus group discussions, people who are participating in surveys, people who are taking part in our observations, as well as our access to files, administrative data, policy data, and in some cases, court case data. So while none of these activities are necessarily subject to formal ethics approval, what I would like to advocate here is, especially under pandemic circumstances, we would need to engage with unorthodox methods of data collection, which then requires us to be hyper vigilant about our own conduct and practices with acknowledgement of our research subjects. The researcher is any one of us who conducts research, and that is not limited to just students, academics, but it also includes the category of scholars, practitioners, service providers, as well as legal personnel. Because what they do include processes of accreditation, reporting, analysis, and evaluation. So you actually have many interlocutors in the research community other than your professor or your committee members that you will be interacting with. And I think this is really important to remember as a fact under pandemic circumstances where virtually everybody is suffering from heightened levels of isolation. So do not limit your research community just to your supervisor or just your committee members. Do link up with fellow students as much as possible, virtually, of course. Academics elsewhere, including overseas ones, scholar practitioners who work in civil society organizations, service providers from whom you collect data, and any other possible interlocutor that you can have conversations and debates with concerning your research. So a gatekeeper is an interesting notion in terms of research practices. This is a person or an institution who formally or informally controls access to people's or situations that relate to our research. So it could be an academic forum, it could be government authorities, it could be self-appointed or formally appointed leaders of communities, service providers, heads of families or households. If you're doing research in a legal setting, it could be personnel at a court. And it is really important to acknowledge the capacity of the gatekeeper as a provider of information. And it's really, really important, especially under COVID circumstances, that gatekeepers, this particular category of people, are under particular strain and stress because if they're essential service providers, they take individual risks to be at work. And if they are working from home and virtually, their stress levels and working conditions have been really not optimal. And therefore, there might be longer waiting time periods when you try to reach out. And when the pandemic set in, I was teaching public policy and public law, and this was a graduate class, and my students were set to do interviews with government officers and particular stakeholders. And with the setting of the pandemic and the switching to virtual service provision, most of these interviews came to a sudden halt, and we had to devise different ways of reaching out to these people, including written question and answer interview format. Some of them asked the interlocutor to record themselves and send the recording to the researcher. And we had to come up with ad hoc solutions on the spot. And that really made me realize that these kind of solutions have to be systematized, because these conditions were really affecting the way one could even conclude coursework with experiential education component. So to wrap up the basics concerning code of ethics under COVID or no COVID, the particularly important fundamental approach that I adhere and I urge you to adhere is to uphold, apply, and adopt key ethical principles of voluntary informed consent, confidentiality and privacy, and do no harm to the specific contexts that are applicable to your interlocutors, as well as acknowledgement of their participation and their contributions. There are other issues that I will cover in the context of the discussion, but these three principles are really, really essential, especially under COVID circumstances where people's lives have been turned upside down. And the engagement with these principles requires proactive, thoughtful engagement and continuous critical reflection, not just about your own work, but also about the situation or the people and groups and communities that you're interacting with to conduct your research. If there are any questions thus far, please use the chat function on the site so that I can actually address them at the end of my presentation. So the genuine voluntary informed consent can be really challenging to obtain under normal circumstances, and if it's even more so under COVID circumstances, not least because there are often unequal power relations or dependence on service providers on the part of the researcher. So one of the things you really need to think very carefully about is how consent applies to your particular project. If you're dealing with documents and data produced by professionals, how consent applies to volunteers sharing information, how consent applies to authorities and others that you're interviewing, as well as if you use data from archives and or individual diaries and interviews, you really need to acknowledge the fact that you do have to state consent. And that is not just a formal requirement, it's really essential in terms of the social and human sciences and legal studies to understand that our subjects are people. They are living beings, they belong to communities, they occupy positions in the society, they might have particular legal obligations, and then therefore, just because we're under COVID-19 circumstances, you cannot just shed the responsibility of ascertaining that you have genuine voluntary informed consent and your interlocutors are clearly identified. Confidentiality and privacy are equally important, especially when the status, liberty, and safety of the participants and their friends, families, and associates are potentially impacted by your research findings and your research practices. And therefore, you do need to acknowledge the confidentiality and privacy of the participants if they desire it to be so, and do not name them in your research. If it's archival research, that's a different matter. You do need to prove that you have been to those archives and you have participated. If it is interviews with participants who do not want to be identified, and that could be because they occupy a legal or official position and they're speaking in personal capacity, then there are ways of citing their views. Those views are legitimate, and those interviews are legitimate. Nonetheless, you do need to respect the confidentiality and privacy of the informants, so to speak. And finally, doing no harm in research practices means you have to proactively prioritize the dignity, safety, and well-being of your participants, partners. If you are employing research assistants, your research assistants, students, interpreters, researchers of all kinds. So particular attention you have to pay to the ways in which your research directly or indirectly can harm, potentially traumatize your participants, as well as contribute to the general discourse of racism, xenophobia, criminalization of certain subjects, and many other social and political trends. So you cannot assume research speaks for itself. Your findings have to be contextualized, and the doing no harm principle in terms of your interlocutors has to be the prime motive for engagement as far as you're concerned. And that applies to COVID circumstances as well. We do know, for instance, that at the onset of the pandemic, Chinese and Asian communities in North America have been singularly attacked, and they have been blamed for the pandemic. At the moment, under pandemic circumstances, refugees and asylum seekers who are living in camps and substandard dwellings have been criminalized and attacked for leading to the wider spread of the virus. So societal inequities and political clashes continue while you're undertaking research under COVID-19 circumstances, and you really need to be aware of the surrounding discourses concerning your particular subject of research. And the last few items that I will acknowledge in terms of key research principles under COVID-19 is the autonomy of the participants. If they decide they would like to withdraw their consent, you are under no position to force them. At the same time, in a position of being an expert or having expertise on other people's lives and experiences, one should be very careful about not generalizing and putting them under risk. Equity refers to acknowledging intersecting unequal power relations when we do research, which is furthered by COVID circumstances. And we have to take every essential step to mitigate the effects of this inequity in our research relationship. Remember, you are claiming to be in a position of authority, and you're making judgments about historical circumstances, people's lives, community relations, as well as political events. And therefore, you have to acknowledge the fact that your findings will inadvertently affect these communities. Diversity and competence and the spirit of partnership are other key components of ethical principles that you must uphold. So on that note, I'm going to ask our students to take a moment and to think about whether they have any specific questions concerning these particular principles that I just addressed for research under COVID-19 circumstances. And I'm going to get into the more nitty-gritty and maybe fun part of how do you do research under COVID-19 when you cannot reach people, when you cannot touch people, when you cannot even see your mother and father, never mind traveling. So there are many ways that alternative methods have been employed in research and collection of data and knowledge creation. But historically, those methods have often applied to situations where you have to refer to archival data, or you are dealing with communities who cannot be reached in face-to-face contact, or people who are medically quarantined. And so one of the things that we're doing right now is inviting our students to think about these alternative methods, which are now becoming pro forma normal methods under COVID-19 circumstances. So the first one that is becoming quite common is photo, video, and voice elicitation. And this method involves asking your research participants to use a camera or voice recording and to take photos or make videos and voice memos. And I'm going to use these methods actually in my upcoming graduate class, which is starting in January. And we have been using them since March in our classes, where students needed to make presentations and they cannot be possibly present, partially because in some of the programs I work with frontline healthcare workers who are taking evening classes, and they just cannot be present at the time of the class. So these methods have already been used, but you can similarly employ these methods in terms of collecting your data. And these recordings obviously fall under the category of the confidentiality and then the privacy and then the voluntary consent principles to be applied to. Nonetheless, they allow you a simulacrum of actual interaction and your research participants sharing their opinions, ideas, memories with you in a recorded fashion. So the onus is on you then to decode these recordings, either in terms of transcripts or referring to interviews with the date and the time, but they are certainly considered as documentation. And there's a whole literature concerning how you use these. Again, if our students are interested, I can send this literature to them. The second method of engaging with research practices, especially applicable to doctoral students, refers to diaries and journaling. These methods can be combined with asking participants to complete diaries during the research or journals, in addition to voice memos or online platform sharing. Diaries can be combined with interviews that you conduct, again, virtually. And often diaries and diary entries can act as a prompt for further discussion and deliberation on the part of the researcher. Diaries can be structured like a questionnaire if you give questions in advance. They could be semi or unstructured, just like interviews, and they could allow for free-flowing reflection. There are specific circumstances whereby each of these forms could be applicable, but the onus is on you to keep these diaries safely, and also to respect the privacy of the people who are keeping these diaries for you. If you're dealing with archived diaries, if you're doing political history research, historical research of any other kind, legal history research, then at the moment, archives and libraries are working under very strenuous conditions, and likely you would need to deal with online copies of records, and sometimes you might need to reach to particular families to get permission to share or rather have access to diaries of particular individuals. In each of these cases, please remember to thank profusely the people who are helping you under such difficult circumstances. Diaries can also be used in a communal form. So, for instance, if you're looking at the disappeared individuals under certain war circumstances, and you're looking at diaries that survived that war, then again, you can use them as a cluster, but you have to acknowledge the fact that these are personal accounts and diaries. In terms of other ways of dealing with documents and participants declaring their interest, obviously the most common or the most commonly acknowledged form is online interviews. An online interview is a structured conversation, and you must remember that. So therefore, you have to really prepare your question set. You have to get in contact with your interviewer, and you have to acknowledge the technology used to record the interview, as well as go through the confidentiality, privacy, and voluntary consent components of your research. The role of technology in facilitating real-time co-presence and in interactivity, just like we're doing right now, I am with you in real time, is no doubt an element that alleviates some of the hindrances caused by COVID-19. However, you must remember that humans are social beings, and the kind of interaction we actually have face-to-face includes body language, pauses, appreciation, the gaze, and none of these components are necessarily present in an online interview. So one of the things that I strongly suggest that you adhere to is slow down the process. If you're having an online interview, often I give a very strange example. There has to be a certain beat to your elocution and the way you deliver questions. And if you observe the participant or the interviewee being uncomfortable, you should not put them under the gun, because this is a recorded interview, and that really changes the nature of the interaction, and people can become very stressed. They might be very reluctant to relay personal information, knowing that this is recorded. So if that is the case, you have to acknowledge the fact that you understand the stress, and also you might need to assure them that this recording will not be shared by anyone other than themselves and you. So, studies that look at offline interview practices and remote practices such as telephone interviewing versus online synchronized interviews indicate that synchronized interviews are the closest form of human interaction if your research requires human participants and asking questions. You can also engage in asynchronous interviewing. So, I mean, for a recent issue of the journal I'm a co-editor of, I actually engaged in asynchronous interviewing with 2 senior scholars. And what I did was I sent them in a letter format detailed questions, and I wanted them to speculate. I wanted them to write about these questions, but it was only semi-structured in the sense that they were able to add new questions or disagree with my questions. And so that's an asynchronous interviewing, and it can take an online form, but that means your questions are not written in stone, and there's flexibility in terms of adjusting your approach and follow threads of the conversation in terms of opening up new doors and understanding the subtle meanings of what the participants are sharing with you, as well as conducting anonymous interviews, whereby the website interface actually allows you to not to identify the person if they wish not to be identified. So the key question in that context is, how do you design your questions? If your interview questions, as I stated, declare that you have expert knowledge, and the participant is basically provide you further information to ascertain your knowledge, there's a certain power dynamic introduced into the situation, and that also kind of delimits the scope of the interview, as opposed to if you consider yourself as a learner and don't go with closed questions but open questions, with the presumption that you have something out there to discover rather than to dictate to the person that you're interviewing. That often leads to much better results. And frankly, for PhD research especially, I think it's not apt to go with closed questions because you have not established your expertise in the field yet. You cannot go with statements that are written in stone, which are dictated onto the interviewer. And you might say, oh, I don't do that. We all do that. We all come with conclusions to the table. And we all have a tendency as academics to use our participants as affirming subjects to our viewpoint. And therefore, this is something you have to guard yourself against, not just during your student years, but also afterwards. So be ready to ask questions, even key questions that invite insights from the participant's opinion and experience. Secondly, if you ask your questions in a what I call 5-line format, you've lost your participant already. You have to have your questions simple, clear, relevant to the point, and if need be, you should be ready to repeat those questions in a different format. Remember, this is online; it's not in person, and therefore there is already a distancing factor concerning technology and recording. And when you set up interviews, even if it's online, you have to respect people's timelines. You have to be prompt. You have to be present when you promised. And if you're going to delay, you have to inform your participant well in advance. And in other words, you have to respect their time and their effort as much as it would have been a situation where you're personally visiting them. In terms of coordinating time zones, you also have to make sure that your software is up to date, and your interview may not be in the situation of having the most up-to-date software, in which case you have to provide them the necessary technical help. You cannot expect everybody to have the latest version of a laptop or have a paid membership to Zoom. And those are responsibilities that you have to shoulder, and you can always reach out to your institution to provide you the essential support for these kinds of research activities. One of the things that we learned with COVID is that our institutions actually have certain potential in terms of providing the background and the service work if we really ask. And I don't think this is about global north, global south. Higher education institutions are prepared to step in when there is dire need, such as the time like this one. In terms of doing the interview, I can talk a lot about how you conduct yourself and how you manage difficult circumstances. But this would take too much of a time, and that actually would really require a training session. So if students are interested in details, again, I can send them references that they can use concerning what's called a mobile present and video ethnographies, as well as other interview techniques. So the last one in terms of simulating in-person contact is the GoPro action cameras and using wearable cameras and or engaging in street photography. In most of the constituencies under COVID-19, although there are regular lockdowns which curtail people's ability to move outside, there's still a window of opportunity where you can actually somehow move within your own neighborhood, region, city, and when possible within the country. So one of the things that we know some people have done is use wearable cameras and or resort to street photography to collect data about common situations and collective situations, and then use these as research material. Need I say that these do not engage with the consent process, and that doesn't mean you can't use them, but you have to exhibit extra care in terms of not identifying people's faces and respecting their privacy, and not documenting people in subhuman conditions and using those as a simply voyeuristic material for your research. So you again have to use the respect and dignity component of the ethical principles I acknowledged at the beginning. In terms of epistolary asynchronous interviews mediated by technology, that means both the interviewee and the interviewer select suitable technology, and what happens is you record your questions, and then the other party records their answers and they reach back to you. So that could be because the other party or parties may not have the time to allocate for you, such as if they're a service provider. Let's say you're doing work on COVID-19 first line responders, right? I mean, most of them are working 12-hour days, and they certainly will not be able to respond to your questions while they're trying to resuscitate the patient. So you will have to pose your questions in a recorded way, and then when they have the time and the energy, they respond in a recorded fashion. All of these fall under the category of informed consent, and when you do the decoding of the interviews, you have to make sure that the authenticity of the subject matter covered is duly reflected, and you're not adding portions such as your own interpretation of what the person said to the transcript. The transcript has to be bare, in the sense that it has to be verbatim, word to word, as to what was declared to you. Online discussion platforms. This is a sore subject in the sense that many of us had to use them. I taught online in several different universities since March, and to my surprise, and not so much to my delight, most of them use different online tools and different online platforms. And yet there's one component that is common, which is in online teaching and research platforms, there is always an online discussion component, which is embedded into the course context, and that is to be in lieu of in-person interaction in the classroom. So many of you who are students, I'm sure, experienced that you had to enter weekly chats, opinions, write blogs. You then had to respond to fellow students' questions in an online discussion platform. and then you are graded on the basis of the quality of your interactions, which then constitutes the participation component of the classroom. So online discussion platforms, when they are delivered in a classroom context, are fairly controlled. But when you move into the endless universe of the Ethernet, which is the web world, the online present, then the nature of online discussion platforms changes. So for instance, if you're engaging in research on migration or citizenship, online platforms, unless they're a closed group, are open to the public, and you might easily be targeted for your opinions, for your questions, for your publications, and therefore you really need to check the quality of the online platform that you're taking apart. If it is a closed group, there are often group rules that you have to adhere to, and there's a certain limit in terms of how much you can inquire and how much you can share. It's certainly not a good practice. Neither it is respectful of the privacy of the participants. Try to engage in online interviews through online discussion platforms. It is a no-no. Just do not do that. Those platforms should be used in terms of having access to, let's say, conferences, workshops, new publications. But I would be very hesitant, and I would urge you not to engage in online political discussions and online discussion platforms concerning your research. That is not a sound practice. Neither does it have any credibility in terms of your own research practices. And again, a word of a precaution, under COVID circumstances, we are seeing an upsurge of mental health ailments and issues among our students and our fellow workers that is due to very lengthy periods of isolation. So people are already feeling very on edge. And if you are unduly attacked on an online discussion platform, whereby your work and sometimes even your personality, your ethnic background, your religion is taken apart, you will become very vulnerable. So you always protect yourself in terms of your identity, in terms of your research findings, and only engage in online platform discussions in a very limited capacity. In terms of video-based interviews, discussions using YouTube, I used to give training on that account because I do human rights work. And there are certain protocols you do need to cover concerning the validity of the YouTube footage that you're referring to or using. That includes interviews. It is quite possible some phantom group is staging some fake interview and using it as data. And there are certain technical ways of ascertaining who the source is, when the video was uploaded to YouTube, whether you can actually trace the source. These are very essential, and they're also essential in terms of your referencing practices. You cannot just cite YouTube video at such and such date with a title. That is not a valid source. So be very careful about using YouTube material and other forms of recorded material as a veritable source, unless and until you did the verification yourself. And as I said, there are technical ways of doing that to make sure that the footage is genuine and it is representing the views of the people that it declares to be representing. The story completion method. I mean, that's a very, very strange way of putting a research practice down. So, I mean, why would anyone need to refer to the word story when you're doing academic research? Well, that is because under COVID circumstances, it is often impossible for you to go back to your interviewee or your source. You probably have one of a chance to get in touch with them, to ask questions, to get the answers back. And therefore, in terms of ascertaining the validity of the information, certainly you are obliged to write back to them and share your findings with your interlocutor. But in terms of putting it in context, you can often not have the chance to go back and then get further information. And therefore, you would need to use what we call a composite approach to your research. On the one hand, you have synchronous or asynchronous research methods that you employ, interviews, video footage, blogs, diaries, archival methods. On the other hand, you really need to actually collect the contextual data yourself through your readings, through documents that you can reach, and fill in the blanks. So let's say you're talking about hospital conditions under COVID-19 in one particular constituency, and you did interviews with 5 frontline nurses. The background of nurse training and appointment of nurses to the hospital, as well as the body of the volume of the patients that hospital serves, you have to ascertain yourself, and that's what is referred to as story completion method. So you have to do the footwork in terms of contextualizing the data that you are able to collect under COVID-19 circumstances. I'm just going through the list. There are many other methods that you could use. The one that I would caution you against is relying heavily on Facebook and Twitter groups. Although these are high participant engagement and they are prone to what we call tick data collection, and there are multiple levels of discussion. They also allow for prolonged engagement. Here is the catch. You don't really know who you're dealing with. I mean, Facebook identification is very iffy. So I can go and register myself with 5 different names on the Facebook with different pictures, and you wouldn't know it's me. You can have lengthy conversations with me, and similarly it applies to you. So the security component as well as trust component, both in Twitter and Facebook, are very minimal. And therefore, you have to exercise extra precaution when you're dealing with Facebook interest groups. There's also the issue of co-production and academic honesty. When you are using Google, Facebook, Microsoft for data collection, there could be a claim made on your research in the sense that you're not the only person who's engaged in this research, and you're using other people's work to ascertain your own position. So in order to guard yourself against such charges, which include academic honesty, which is an entirely different discussion, which we might engage at another time, especially under COVID pandemic circumstances, you have to go back to the main protocol. The confidentiality, privacy, informed consent, dignity, security, and the accuracy of the source that you're using. All of these apply to all of the online sources of information that you're using, including YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and more. So to wrap it up, because I'm reaching 47 minutes, in terms of innovative and creative methods in research under pandemic circumstances or any other extenuating circumstances, which seem to be with us for a while to come yet, you have to be vigilant, and you have to be hopeful, and you have to be engaged, and you always have to use your critical facilities. But most of it all, you have to realize that there are ways of continuing with your research, and you should not give up. You should not postpone your research project. Do not postpone that thesis proposal. Do not postpone that second chapter you were to finish back in March. Just continue and realize that there are hundreds and thousands of young researchers who are in the same position as you are. And we are here to guide you and to provide as many possible alternatives as possible. And your institution will likely support your extra needs when it comes to especially technologically enhanced research methods. So thank you. I'm going to wrap it up here now, and I can look at questions. I cannot read the questions on the side. They're kind of overlapping. So
I will try my best to help you, Hojam, in that respect. But I need to explain here with a great, let's say, happiness that, the audience here today is basically PhD students and master's students under the Graduate School of Social Sciences. So it is very nice also to see that there are lots of questions and good questions. And as far as I understood, the question of Abdul Salam, regarding the positive and the negative effects of COVID-19, you already covered, Hojam. Same for, to some extent, Mumtaz Ali. Maybe we can go on, and thank you very much, dear friends, for these questions. There is a question: could you explain the reliability of these kind of questionnaires which published via internet for collecting data?
I think there's a certain protocol concerning the source, who's preparing the questionnaire. If it's a company or an establishment that already has established reputation in the field of, let's say, public research data collection, then obviously the questionnaire could be relied upon. You must remember, even under normal circumstances, most of these questionnaires collect data online or through phone interviews. So nothing has changed since then. What might have changed is the availability of people in terms of being able to collect immediate responses. And I think you're right. There's a certain margin of error in terms of COVID-19 questionnaire collection of data. Nonetheless, I would go with the source. But I would precaution you about these data collections and questionnaires and summary research findings that are circulating on the internet that are not traceable to an identifiable source. And our students are very gullible in that respect because they haven't dealt with that kind of phenomenon before. And the onus is on us for us to train them that, you know, not every research finding is reliable. You really have to trace them to an institution, to a source. You have to have a date. You have to have the sample size. You have to have the methodology explained in the beginning of the questionnaire, which would then make it at least semi-reliable. But data itself is absolutely not reliable. I want to go back to the earlier question concerning students being affected by COVID-19. And I'm going to say something that you may not necessarily appreciate right now, but especially those of you who are coming for your comprehensive exams and thesis defense. It made it possible for us to bring the best scholars in the world for the defenses as externals, because normally it's a very costly process to fly somebody in and to accommodate them, especially from overseas. And I sat through 2 defenses, actually 3, during the COVID-19. These are PhD defenses. And they were very engaged discussions, 3-hour plus, with the best experts in the field. And I don't think that this is the best practice. The online defense is the best practice, but I think it opens certain avenues for us to consider sharing knowledge with experts in the field without necessarily having the budget to bring them in person to the room. And it applies also to online course teaching. I mean, we opened up to different methodologies of reaching to our students in terms of international expertise. Webinars, which were seen as some sort of a peculiar practice by certain NGOs, are now becoming quite a common practice across higher education institutions. And it's not the best, and it shouldn't be the only, but I think it's a valuable addition to the existing arsenal of tools we have for education.
There is actually, as I said, lots of questions, but there is also a question from Mohammed Karami. He actually was also trying to explain that there are challenges under this pandemic, COVID-19, and he's asking, how can we overcome these types of problems, especially in the case that there is no alternative technique to collect data?
Right. So I believe Mohammed Karami is referring to in-person interviews, face-to-face interviews. I was personally supervising a thesis which required in-person interviews. And unfortunately, in that case, we needed to alter the research proposal. We needed to alter the thesis proposal because there was no way that kind of in-person interviews could be conducted until there was widespread inoculation against COVID. So sometimes one has to take dire measures, such as changing not the topic of the dissertation, but the method used. Let's say if you have to work in refugee camps, or if you have to do face-to-face interviews in a community, know that these will not be possible until the lockdown conditions are over. Another way of dealing with that is if you have a methodology or theory chapter, you could concentrate on that and then use the time, the passage of time, until COVID-19 is somehow alleviated in terms of in-person contact to prepare other parts of your work. But these are the only 2 options that I can offer, other than the fact that the list of methods that I shared with you for synchronized, asynchronized, online, diaries, recordings, video recordings, blogs, those kinds of approaches to interviewing and data collection. And remember, if you're dealing with disprivileged communities and marginal communities, technology is going to be a problem. And therefore, in your case, for instance, it may not be possible to do the online synchronized or asynchronized version. But if you're dealing with, let's say, an international institution such as United Nations, then most likely the person you're going to reach out will have the technological facilities to respond to your request. So really, you have to be aware of the social, cultural, and economic positionality of the people you're reaching out. And you have to be very aware of the context.
Well, actually, Hocam, there are also certain related questions to each other, like when there is absence or weakness of having internet and these kind of techniques, like Mohammed Usman and Atong Agwam, they ask similar questions that if in a condition a researcher whose research involves interacting with the others and who are not, having facilities during this pandemic, what would you like to suggest?
So I'm going to go back to one of the things I mentioned, which is a semi-structured and asynchronous interview. So you can actually form your questions, but with the margin left for the interviewee and the participant to interject their own opinion, send it out. And when internet is a possibility or when phoning is a possibility, so once they have it, they have time to think about it. They could write back or they can formulate some answers. They can have a community discussion, and then you reach out to them again and collect the answer. And that's one way of making sure that if internet and computer literacy are problems, then you're alleviating the problem as much as possible. Another possibility is using Skype. I know personally that making international calls through Skype is significantly cheaper. And if the other party can actually get Skype on their mobile phone, you do have the possibility of at least writing back and forth without necessarily paying phone charges or without necessarily relying on computer technologies. So you have to be creative. And I know this sounds horrible. I mean, this is not your making, but again, we're all in the same situation. At the beginning of the summer, I had to do 2 lots of overload teaching because my elder colleagues at the university could not adjust to internet technologies with the drop of the hat to teach their doctoral courses. So the weight shifted onto us in terms of being adaptive and responding as soon as possible. So what I'm trying to suggest is we are also in the same boat. We have to adapt and learn things that we were not trained for. I am not trained as a computer expert. And I certainly did not spend 30 years of my life to teach online. But when we have to do it, we have to do it. So you have to also adjust to the circumstances, be creative, be generous with yourself. Don't get frustrated. And you try one thing if it doesn't work. And as I said, I'm going to share some resources with the students who are attending to this seminar today. And in those resources, there are clearly identified pathways to do alternative forms of research.
Thank you, Hocam. And the last question is going to be asked by the director of our graduate school of social sciences, Mustafa Hocam.
You're muted. Muted.
Okay, yeah, dear Professor Dr. Nergis Canefe, thank you very much for your enormous knowledge sharing with us. I think it's already very beneficial for the students because, both for the research methodology lecture and the philosophy of social science courses, we just try to give some specific clues for them how they can design any research directly related with the world problematic issue. And we are always repeating as all professors in the nearest university that your research has to be addressed by the universal problem. No, it hasn't to be limited by the local or global level, And I just would like to point out the hierarchy of knowledge by following up the strategy for designing any research. What I mean about which starts from observing nodes, I mean the physical process according to the hierarchy of knowledge, and then data that we are collecting from the field, like ethnographic observation, for example. By doing ethnographic observation, we can collect data. And when we are trying to organize data, it means that we are going to reach to the information as well. But information is still nonsense for us because we do not use our skills, knowledge, beliefs, competencies, or whatever in the research still is absent. And what I believe that when any researcher can have a chance to use their skills, abilities in their research, it's going to be start specifying, and it's going to go through the universal level as well. So what do you think this issue by following the hierarchy of knowledge in any kinds of research, especially during the pandemic? Do you believe that it's going to be shortcut way of doing research, or what else?
I mean, this is a wonderful question, and it's a perennial concern as you address. Sometimes we might be confused during the pandemic because we cannot always follow the same steps. Our lives have been turned upside down, and hence the title of this talk, When the World is on Fire. We cannot access our own colleagues, discussion groups, classroom structure has changed, our students cannot interact with each other, libraries are shut down. So the way we conduct ourselves, even as established academics, had to change. And there's a certain fluidity introduced into the process. Mm-hmm. The calmness and the methodical nature of conducting research has become much more hectic. Mm-hmm. And in so many ways, perhaps the upside of this confusion is that we have to pay more attention and more respect to our interlocutors, because without their consent, we are not able to go into places, we are not able to collect as we please. Our agency has been curtailed and limited because of the pandemic as researchers and academics. So the human interaction component really requires the willingness of the other party to invest their energy and means to interact with us. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling, and I know this is counterintuitive, that this whole pandemic experience in some ways speeds things up, but in another way slow things down in a way that it should have been. It gives us more time to think about our questions and the relevance of things that we consider as most important. When people are dying left, right, and center, when they cannot sustain themselves from day to day, some of the questions need to be recontextualized. And I think it might be a wake-up call for academia, not trying to push for an agenda for practical knowledge production, but to be really aware of our circumstances and how people we relate to actually live their day-to-day lives. I think it's making it very starkly observable, the power inequalities, the class, the citizenship component. And therefore, in the end, I think this could be a useful learning path for ourselves as well as senior academics, that we need to really be patient and considerate and respectful of the subjects who constitute our research interlocutors.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hocam, once again. And as the graduate School of Social Sciences, Behiye Hocam, the Deputy Director, Sayit Hocam, the Chairman of International Relations Department. We would like to, on behalf of our program, we would like to thank you very much for this stimulating and lively lecture. Behiye Hocam, would you like to
Thank you very much, Hocam. Thank you very much for your valuable speech for ourselves, although not at least our students. It's very valuable for all of us. Thank you for your kind presentation.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I miss you all. I hope to see you in person sometime in 2021.
I hope so.
My dear colleague Sayit Hocam.
Nergis Hocam, thank you very much. It has been informative as always. It has been a pleasure to host you. And I think it was very useful actually for us, for our students, because they are about to start their publication processes. Some of them are basically in that process itself, facing difficulties. So it was very enlightening in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mustafa Hocam, would you like to, say?
Yeah, I just tried to close the session.
Okay. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Professor Nergis Canefe, it was amazing. What I am feeling from the students that they already have a full satisfactory from your speech, because we always try to stimulate them to be always and to make the research at the international and the global level. And when we invite any professors who are conducting with the international and the global level, they are always feeling themselves very happy. And this is the moment that we are living right now, that the students are very happy. And we, as a graduate schools and the international relations and the political science departments, also would like to thank again and again for sharing your enormous experiences and knowledge with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And happy New Year to all of you and your students.
Thank you very much.